Namaskar. We have completed with module 1, which comprised 2 hours, and we studied the introduction to consumer behavior. Now we will move on to module 2, which is a market, where we are speaking of market research and consumer behavior. This particular module will be completed in 2 hours and will cover the following topics. 1. The relevance of market research with consumer behavior. 2. Approaches to consumer behavior research. 3. Research perspectives on consumer behavior. 4. Research paradigms in consumer behavior. And 5. The consumer research process. So, we shall be completing these 5 topics in 2 hours, and this is a part of module 2, which is market research and consumer behavior. Today I shall be doing the first hour with you, and we will be speaking about the following 4 topics. We will start with discussion on relevance of market research with consumer behavior. Then we will speak about approaches to consumer behavior research. We will speak about research perspectives on consumer behavior, and we shall sum it up with the various research paradigms in consumer behavior. So, let us start with this particular module, and we will first talk about relevance of market research with consumer behavior. Now, I am sure you are aware that both consumer behavior and market research are broad subject areas in marketing itself. They are 2 separate elective papers, which are 2 separate papers, I must say, which are form a part of the syllabus of the postgraduate MBA programs running across the country. Now, while the 2 of them are separate papers and important in their own selves, they basically contribute to each other. Market research contributes to the study of consumer behavior, and without the support having been provided by market research, we would not be able to actually move on to understand the consumer or predict him or influence him and be able to attain our objectives of profit and success. So, it is very important that as a marketer we focus on the study of the market. And how do we focus on the study of the market? It is through market research that we will be able to study and have a focus study the market, the segments in the market, and identify threats and opportunities. So, let us start with the relevance of market research in consumer behavior. Now, each individual is unique in himself. He or she has his own needs and wants, and these needs and wants vary from person to person. We have already discussed previously that marketers identify segments. They identify such segments, they target one or few of them, and they position their offerings accordingly. We have also discussed the marketing concept, which said that the basic objective of any marketer should be to able to identify customer needs and wants and deliver the product and service offerings so as to satisfy customers more efficiently and effectively than the competitor. So, here we will see whatever we have done in the first module will help us now in the second module. So, we have already spoken about the customer, we have already spoken about how consumers are unique in themselves, we have already spoken about how segments are identified, how they are targeted, how they are few of them are selected, how the products are positioned. We have also spoken about the the marketing concept, which is the edifice to the study of consumer behavior. Now, if you put all of these together, we will be able to sum it up in just one sentence, that in order to understand and predict consumption patterns and market behavior within such segments, market research becomes extremely essential. So, basically in order to understand and predict consumption patterns and consumption behaviors within a segment within the market, it is very important that you basically have a study or have a proper understanding of market research. So, if you see here, we have something to illustrate. You have the marketing concept, okay, which is the it acts as an edifice for market research as well as consumer behavior. So, we start market research with the objective of identifying customer needs and wants, providing the desired satisfaction more effectively and efficiently than the competitor. We also go in for market research to identify opportunities and threats. So, marketing concept gives in a kind of a cue to marketing research, and through the study of marketing research, we will be able to study and understand consumption patterns and consumption behavior. So, the marketing concept says identify customer needs, give them the desired satisfaction in terms of goods and services, satisfy their needs and wants. So, market research helps us do that better. Market research will help us identify the needs and wants. It will help us identify the rival segments. It will help us how we should be able to provide the right kind of product or service offering. What should be the marketing strategy? What should be the marketing mix? So, all this input will come to us through market research, and ultimately market research will help us study and understand consumption patterns and behavior. Now, what is market research? Market research basically is an organized effort to gather information about the market and about and the customers which exist in the marketplace. So, an organized effort to gather information, to gather knowledge about the consumers, about market segments, or about the market as a whole is what market research helps us in. It is the systematic collection, analysis and interpretation of data. Selection, it basically helps us in terms of collection, analyzing, interpreting data related to the marketing and related to the surrounding environment. So, market research basically helps us gather information about the market segments, about the customers. It is a systematic collection, analysis and interpretation of information related to the market and to the surrounding environment. So, this is what market research is. Now, we have spoken about the surrounding environment. Now, what is this environment? What is the environment facing a company? As I said, market research will help us understand market segments, understand the consumers as a whole, and it is going to be related to collection, analyzing and interpretation of data related to the environment facing a company. Now, what is this environment facing the company? When we speak about environment facing the company, we are talking about two kinds of environment, the micro environment and the macro environment. What is the micro environment? Now, forces that are close to the company and affect the company directly comprise what we call as the micro environment. So, the environmental forces which are immediate to the company, closest to the company and affect the company directly are comprise what we call as the micro environment. This will include the company's internal environment, its customers, its competitors, its suppliers, its dealers and the various other channel intermediaries. So, all of them put together comprise what we call as the micro environment. The environment outside the environment surrounding the organization can also be the macro environment. What is this macro environment? Now, macro environment are forces in the environment that first affect the micro environment and through that they affect the company. In other words, they affect the company indirectly. So, macro forces surrounding the organization or surrounding the company, they first impact the micro forces, and after having impacted the micro forces, they impact the company. So, in other words, they have an effect on the company in an indirect manner. Now, what are examples or what are basically what comprises the macro environment? The demographic factors, socioeconomic factors or technological factors, cultural factors, political factors, natural factors, legal environment, all of this actually comprises what we call as the macro environment. Now, the forces in the macro environment affect all the companies operating in a particular industry in the same manner. Please remember that we have two kinds of environments, a micro and a macro. The micro affects the company directly and the macro affects the company indirectly via the micro. Now, all the different companies in a particular industry will be impacted by the macro environment in a similar manner. So, this is what is the environment of surrounding a company. Now, we just said that market research helps us in collection, analyzing and interpreting data with respect to the market and the surrounding environment of a company. So, the surrounding environment of the company, as I said, could be the micro and the macro. Now, to be specific, market research helps us understand the specific marketing situation facing a company, identify the needs and wants of customer segments, identify the most viable segment, and provide inputs through formulation of appropriate marketing strategies through the design of appropriate marketing mix, or the 4 Ps. So, market research helps us understand specific market situations facing a company, identify needs and wants of the customer, identify viable segments, and serve these segments better through appropriate marketing strategies in the form of the 4 Ps. Now, when we talk about appropriate marketing strategies, we are also actually talking of the appropriate marketing mix, or the 4 Ps. So, what do? We start with segmenting, targeting and positioning, okay, and then we move on to designing a perfect blend of the marketing mix, or the 4 Ps. Decisions with respect to product and service mix, pricing, distribution and promotion taken, keeping in mind the environment on the one hand and organizational resources and the constraints on another. Okay. The goal is to achieve maximum efficiency, the goal is to achieve maximum effectiveness, and ultimate goal is basically to meet the needs and the wants of the customer and derive so that the customer may derive total customer satisfaction. So, when we talk of market research helping us in formulating appropriate marketing strategies, we are talking first of beginning the STP, or the segmentation, targeting and positioning, then blending the 4 Ps in the best possible manner so as to be able to gel with the customer segment that you are wanting to cater to, decisions with regard to the product and service mix, pricing, distribution, promotion should be taken by the marketer, keeping in mind the environment on the one hand and organizational resources and constraints on the other. Now, when we are talking of environment, as I just said, we are speaking of macro and micro environment, but also remember in the previous session I had spoken about the complexity and dynamism of the environment. So, when you are formulating your marketing mix and your strategies, you have to keep in mind that these strategies or your mix have to be flexible and they have to be changing with time, as and when environment poses uncertainty, or as and when, because your environment is very complex and very dynamic, you cannot afford to have your 4 Ps in a static state. You will have to keep evolving them. Okay, so market research will help you basically to not only to design your 4 Ps, but also to modify them or change them or modify them, or reorient them so that they can benefit both the customer through customer satisfaction and delight, as well as the seller, or as well as the marketer through greater success, greater survival and greater competitive edge than others. So, basically the goal here for any marketer would be to gain effectiveness and efficiency, and ultimately of course to be able to reach customer objectives, customer needs and wants, and provide the desired satisfaction. So, market research here will help you basically in understanding the environment better, formulating strategies in a better manner, especially when we are talking of complexity and dynamism in the environment. Okay. Now, market research would also help us understand through a conscious attempt what does the customer buy, why does he buy, when does he buy, where does he buy from, how much does he buy, how often does he buy. So, with ready answers with respect to all of these actually come from market research. So, issues with respect to the consumer decisions or consumer purchase decisions, or what does he buy, why does he buy, when does he buy, where does he buy it from, how much does he buy, how often does he buy. Now, all of these answers actually we will be able to get through research or through marketing research, and with a ready answer to any on all of these questions gives us direct input into how to devise our marketing strategies and how to adapt our 4 Ps. So, herein lies the integration of market research with consumer behavior. So, you can see here market research basically aims at understanding and predicting consumers better, basically understand and predict consumer behavior. Consumer research will involve processes and tools which will be used to study consumer behavior, and ultimately through understanding and predicting consumer behavior by the application of processes and tools used in the study, we will be able to move towards consumer research. So marketing research actually moves or contributes immensely to consumer research. Now we will speak of or discuss the relationship between marketing research and consumer research through this particular table. So as I just said, market research contributes immensely to consumer research. In fact, marketing research leads to consumer research. Marketing research could be very broad and macro, but consumer research becomes very narrow and micro, very specific. So from market research has evolved the subset of consumer research. As I said, market research is broad, very macro. Consumer research is narrow, very specific, very micro. In fact, consumer research is a subset of market research, and it is from market research that this particular subset has evolved. Now let us compare both marketing research and consumer research on 3 parameters: the objective, the focus, and the end result. Talking of the objective of marketing research is to study the marketing environment and the customers who are a part of it. But the objective of consumer research is to study consumers as individuals or as groups. So here we are going to focus on the consumer as a person or as a family or as a social group. We are not going to study him as a group, operating in an environment. Yes, the person will operate in the environment, but that part of the study will be taken care of by marketing research. When you are talking about consumer research, we are going to only confine our attention to study of consumers as individuals or as in groups. So we are not going to study the consumer with a broader backdrop, but we are going to study him with a narrower focus. Now let's come to focus. In marketing research, the objective is to identify opportunities and threats, to establish trends, to study market and forecast potential, or to predict buying patterns either based on modeling or simulation techniques. But in consumer research, the focus is to understand consumption behavior and consumption patterns. So again, if you see, market research is much broader. You're trying to study the entire market. You're trying to study the company surrounded by an environment, and you're trying to establish or identify opportunities and threats. You're trying to study the market in terms of market growth, market potential, market forecast, trying to study demand, trying to study sales forecast or demand forecast. You're trying to study or buying patterns based on data and based on some form of modeling and simulation. But in the case of consumer research, your focus is basically to understand consumer behavior and consumption patterns. So you're more narrow, you're more specific to the consumer, to his behavior, to his consumption patterns. Now the end result of a market research will be in terms of customer connect with the company, individual marketing and customization. And the end result of a consumer research will also be customer connect with the company, individual marketing and customization. So if you see, the end result for both of them is the same, but the objective with which they start and the focus with which they move ahead in through research is very different. Okay, the end result, of course, for both, whether you are into market research or whether you are studying consumers and you're into consumer research, the end result is a customer connect with the company. Talking of marketing at individual levels, one-to-one market and customization. So this is how we basically form a relationship between marketing research and consumer research. Now let us come to the second component or second constituent of this particular module, where we will be studying about the approaches of of consumer behavior research, and we will be speaking about 2 kinds of broad approaches that have been used in the study of consumer behavior. So approaches to consumer behavior research essentially frame themselves through 2 approaches. The first approach is the traditional approach, and the second approach is the current approach. As far as the first approach is concerned, or the traditional approach is concerned, it manifests itself through 2 sub approaches called positivism and interpretivism. We have already discussed, I made mention of positivism and interpretivism in the previous session, but we'll elaborate on them a little much more. As far as the modern approaches or the current approaches are concerned, it is also called dialectical approach, and it has 4 sub approaches in the form of materialism, change, totality and contradiction. So, the approaches to consumer behavior research are of 2 kinds, traditional and current. Traditional is further manifested in the form of positivism and interpretivism, and the modern or the current or the dialectical approach manifests itself in the form of 4 sub approaches, which are materialism, change, totality and contradiction. So, let us start first with the traditional approaches. Talking about the traditional approaches, as we said, we will first speak about positivist approach. The positivist approach is also called as modernism, and it is the earliest approach to the study of consumer behavior. Okay. So, this particular approach treats consumer behavior as an applied science, okay, and tries to basically focus on the causes of consumer behavior. Of course, these causes would be related to effects as well, but the focus here is a cause and effect. As an applied science, as an earliest approach to studying the discipline, and with a focus on the cause and effect, this approach has the academicians or the researchers who have followed this approach have contributed immensely to the field of consumer behavior. They consider the consumer to be very, very rational. He behaves very rational in the marketplace. He is a problem solver, he is a rational decision maker, and he will make a purchase decision based on collecting information, evaluating all the possible alternatives, and then deciding on the best one based on his rationality and based on his logic. Based on logic, based on rationality and based on his cognition, he would assess all the varied alternatives and decide on one particular alternative after having given too much of a thought. So, this approach basically treats consumers as very, very, very rational. Okay, and the focus again is why do consumers behave like this. So, we are going to speak of the causes of behavior and the effects of such behavior. However, this particular approach called the positivist approach was based on certain assumptions. The assumptions on which the particular approach is based is that consumer actions are based on cause and effect relationships can be generalized. They can be objectively measured and empirically tested. Okay. So, consumer action based on a cause and an effect, okay, can be generalized, and they can be objectively measured, they can be empirically tested. Now, if a marketer or if a researcher could identify the reasons behind consumer behavior, okay, he would be able to predict it, and if they could predict consumer behavior, they would be able to influence it. So, the focus here was to predict consumer behavior. The methodology which they were going to use was essentially quantitative, use of they used techniques like surveys, observations and experiments, and the focus was on large samples. Okay. So, in a nutshell, I would like to just sum up. Here we have the positivist approach, which is one of the earliest approaches to studying consumer behavior. It treats consumer behavior as an applied science. It says that consumer behavior or consumption patterns are basically a cause and an effect, can be a relationship, and it's also said that a man or a consumer is highly rational, highly logical, and takes decisions after much thought, much effort, and decides on the best possible alternative. The assumptions with which this model moved on was that consumer actions are based on cause and effect, they can be generalized, they can be objectively measured, and they can be empirically tested. The focus here was that if a marketer or if a researcher could basically identify the reasons behind or understand the reasons behind how the consumers behave and why they behave in that manner, they will be able to predict it. And once they will be able to predict consumer behavior, they would be able to influence it. So, with this logic, they wanted to conduct research based on this logic and based on these assumptions. Focus here was basically to predict consumer behavior. The approach used both quantitative techniques and focused on large samples. So, quantitative techniques in the form of surveys, questionnaires, observation and experiments, and the focus was on large samples. Why? Because it was based on these large samples that they could test this cause and effect relationship, generalize their findings, and come up with robust models or robust analysis. So this was the positivist approach to understanding consumer behavior. The second approach which came about was the interpretivist approach, which was also called the postmodernism or the experientialist approach. Okay. So gradually what happened, there was a shift in the approach from a positivist approach to a more better and more advanced approach in terms of not only understanding the reasons of behavior, but understanding the customer as such, as a whole, in totality per se. So this particular approach came to be known as postmodernism or experientialism, and here the focus was, or the main objective of this kind of a study was to understand the customer better. Here consumer decision making was not something which was considered to be very objective and rational, rather it was regarded as something which is very subjective. So people behave differently, and consumer decision making is something which is very, very subjective. Yet they said that we could identify common threads, or we could identify common patterns, but nevertheless consumer behavior across consumers, across segments, was something which was very different, and consumer decision making was something which was very subjective. And while we could make generalizations, but it was something which was a complex and a difficult task. The following table will let's talk about the assumptions of this particular approach. The assumptions behind this approach was that consumers are very unique and different, both between consumers and within the same consumer at different times and different situations. So cause and effect behavior could not be generalized. Consumption behaviors are very unique, they are unpredictable, they cannot be measured, they cannot be empirically tested, and they cannot be generalized. The focus here was the act of consumption rather than the act of purchase, and the methodology which the experientialists or the postmodernists used was very qualitative in terms of in-depth interviews, focus group techniques, and other projective techniques. Focus was essentially on small samples. So if you see, the very approach undertaken by positivists and interpretivists were entirely different. The assumptions on which they had formed or framed their theories was also totally different. The interpretivists believed that consumers are unique, and because they are unique, there will be a difference between two consumers or between one consumer behaving in a particular situation and the same consumer behaving differently in another situation. Now, they also said that cause and effect cannot be generalized, and consumption patterns and consumption behaviors cannot be empirically tested, they cannot be objectively measured, they are something which is unpredictable, they cannot be generalized. And if you see, the focus here was not to understand the reasons why they behave, but why they purchase, but the reason here the focus was the act of consumption rather than the act of purchase. In the positivist view, the objective was to study the act of purchase. Why do they buy and how do they buy? But here the focus was the consumption pattern, the act of consumption, the act of purchase, usage, consumption, and repurchase. So the focus was totally different, and the tools and techniques used were also very different. This research was essentially qualitative in nature, with a focus on techniques like focus group interviews, projective techniques, in-depth interviews, and a focus here was not on large samples but on very small samples, because unlike the positivist approach, the interpretivists believed that findings in consumer behavior cannot be generalized. So they did not find or did not consider the need for larger samples. They were ready to basically identify common threads in consumption, act of consumption, based on very small samples. So this is the difference between the two of them. Now let us illustrate the differences between the two in the form of a table. So here we have the positivist and the interpretivist approach. The positivist approach meant the consumer actions are based on cause and effect relationships, and they can be generalized. Okay, but the interpretivist said that the cause and effect relationship cannot be generalized. Consumption patterns are unique and they are unpredictable. Positivists believe that consumer actions can be objectively measured and empirically tested, but interpretivists believe that consumer actions are unique, they are different both between two consumers and within the same consumer at different times. So, consumption act cannot be objectively measured, empirically tested or generalized. In the positivist approach, the focus was to predict consumer behavior, but here the focus was to understand the act of consumption, okay, rather than predicting the act of purchase. So, there while the positivists believed in predicting consumer action and consumer behavior, interpretivists believed in focusing on the act of understanding the consumption process rather than the act of purchase. Methodology used by positivists was quantitative, while the one used by interpretivists was qualitative, and while the positivists believed in large samples, interpretivists believed in having very small samples. Okay. So, now let us move to the current approach. We are done with the traditional approaches, which had two sub approaches in the form of positivists and the interpretivists. Now, let us come to the current approach of studying consumer behavior, which is also called the dialectical approach, and it is more relevant to our current times. Now, what is dialectical? Dialectical basically comes from the word dialectics, and this is something which means to consider all forms of human behavior, including consumption. So, if you are talking about being dialectic in in the context of consumer behavior, we are actually trying to say that you should consider all forms of human behavior, whether it is pre-purchase or it is purchase or it is usage or it is consumption or it is post-purchase. So, we have to consider and the entire human behavior in the marketplace. So, it is much broader in scope, and lot more understanding the customer through by giving him a holistic view rather than talking of him in a very parochial manner. We are talking of him as giving him a holistic studying him in the holistic context rather than studying him in a parochial context. So, when we talk about current approach or dialectics, there are four sub approaches in the form of materialism, change, totality and contradiction. So, let us see what each of these means and how each of these is relevant to us. Starting with starting with materialism, according to this particular approach, consumer behavior is shaped by material environment. What do we mean by material environment? Material environment implies that consumers are essentially very materialistic in nature. Consumers are highly materialistic in nature, and their behavior, their consumption patterns, their act of purchase, usage and overall consumption is shaped by the material environment, is shaped by money, is shaped by possessions, and is shaped essentially consumers are looked upon as some people who are very materialistic, give a lot of importance to money and give a lot of importance to holding on to possessions. So, this is one approach of studying this particular approach called the current approach. The second approach to studying consumer behavior, current approach is the change. Consumer behavior is something which is regarded as something very dynamic. Okay, it is always in a process of transformation, it is always in a process of change, it is always in a process of motion. So, consumer behavior is essentially very dynamic, changing all the time. So, this is another sub approach towards studying the current approach called dialectics. The third sub approach which we speak of is totality. So, consumer behavior is interconnected with other forms of human behavior. So, as I just told you, the current approach or the dialectic deals with studies the consumer with a holistic purpose. So, while they are studying the consumer or studying the human being or studying the consumer in a holistic view or giving him a holistic picture. So, they say that consumers or human beings essentially do not live in isolation. Similarly, consumers do not live in isolation, they are surrounded by other forms of behavior, other forms of environment, either in the form of psychographics or in the form of sociographics. So, when we have to study human behavior or when we have to study consumer behavior, for example, for more relevant to us is consumer behavior. So, when we have to study consumer behavior, we have to study the consumer as a whole. We have to study him against his environment, both in terms of psychographics, his own internal self, as well as an external environment in the form of the sociographic or the situational influences that he or she is exposed to. And finally, contradiction, which is another sub approach of the current approach, which says that changes in consumer behavior actually arise from contradictions, and such contradictions actually happen because of changes in internal changes like mood states or emotions or feelings. So because of many changes that take place, either because because of changes in the affect, or because of changes in the feeling component, because of changes in mood states, because of changes in emotions. So consumer behavior also gets impacted by all of these. The manner in which a consumer will react or act in the marketplace will also be determined by subjective factors in the form of affect, feeling, mood states, and so forth. So this is as far as the the approaches to consumer behavior are concerned. Now we will now move to the research perspectives on consumer behavior. So we have, you see, what are the research perspectives on consumer behavior? There are three broad research perspectives in consumer behavior. They are the decision making perspective, the experiential perspective, and the behavioral influence perspective. So these are broad orientations towards which researchers and academicians have used basically to study this particular discipline. They have either used a decision making perspective, or they have used an experiential perspective, or they have used a behavioral influence perspective. So let us see what each one of them means. When we talk of the decision making perspective, we say that the buying process is sequential in nature. A consumer perceives there is a problem, and then he moves through a series of steps to solve that particular problem. So this particular approach to studying consumer behavior emphasizes the rational, logical, and cognitive approach to consumer decision making and the purchase process. So this is the first approach, this is the first perspective of studying consumer behavior. The second perspective to studying consumer behavior is the experiential perspective, which says that not all buying decisions can be rational, not all buying decisions can be logical. Okay. In some cases, buying happens because of a consumer's desire for happiness, for pleasure, for fun, for fantasy, for good emotional states, mood states. A lot of buying takes place because because of the mood states or the effect or the feeling component which underlies a consumer and his reactions. So this particular approach says that consumers are feelers as well as thinkers. They are not only thinkers, but they are also feelers. And the third approach basically is the behavioral influence approach, which says that forces in the environment stimulate a consumer to make purchases without developing beliefs and attitudes of the product. So what we're trying to say is a lot of situational factors, a lot of environmental factors stimulate a person to make a purchase without he having developed feeling for the product or an attitude towards the product. So many a times people buy not out of rationality or because of feeling, but because of situational, environmental and situational forces that stimulate a consumer to make a purchase. So if you see the three of them, the decision making perspective basically treats consumers as rational human beings who go through the 5-stage decision making process in a very logical, rational manner. A need is identified, and then these consumers move through successive stages of information search, evaluation of alternatives, purchase and post purchase behavior, and they complete the purchase process and post purchase. So the approach here kind of looks at the consumers as extremely rational, extremely cognitive in nature, and this particular process of consumer decision making is something which is very logical, very rational, very scientific, with consumers being thinkers. Okay, so consumers are looked upon as thinkers, and the buying process is regarded as something very sequential in nature. On the other hand, the experiential perspective looks upon consumers not only as thinkers but also as feelers. They say many purchases actually happen because consumers are experience positive emotions or positive mood states, or experience fun, fantasy and hedonic pleasures. So not all buying can be rational, not all buying can be logical. Sometimes people are actually moved into they move to act of purchase out of fun, fantasy, happiness, pleasure, and different kinds of mood states. So they are essentially not only thinkers but also feelers. And then we have the third view, which is the behavioral influence perspective, which says that many a times consumers are neither thinkers nor feelers. They basically act out of situational forces or environmental forces. So because of these environmental forces, they are compelled to make certain kinds of purchases without having developed attitudes for it or beliefs for it, or without having developed any emotional and mood states for it. So these are the three approaches to the study of consumer behavior. These are the three research perspectives to the study of consumer behavior. Now let us come to the research paradigms. Okay, so we are here going to speak of the approaches which are used by a research by researchers in consumer behavior. When we talk about the two approaches, we speak of quantitative approach and qualitative approach. The quantitative approach, as we have just mentioned, basically was used by the positivists, and the qualitative research has been used by the interpretivists. Okay. Both positivists and interpretivists were the traditional approaches. So traditional approach, when we talked about positivists, they used quantitative techniques, and when we spoke of the interpretivists, they used the qualitative approach. But today the current approach, or the dialectic approach, which speaks of totality, contradiction, and materialism and change. Here in the four of them we use both quantitative and qualitative techniques. So when we are studying the consumer holistically as per the current approach, or as per the dialectic approach, we are studying him, analyzing him both in terms of qualitative techniques and through quantitative techniques. Now let us speak a little bit about quantitative techniques and qualitative research in consumer behavior. So quantitative research in consumer behavior makes use of quantitative research techniques. So it comprises research techniques that are used to gather quantitative data over large samples. Statistical tools and techniques are used, like survey techniques, or through questionnaires, or through observation, or through experiments. The research is very descriptive in nature, highly empirical, very analytical, used primarily by positivists, focus on consumption behavior, predicting consumption behavior. Okay, and the findings are something which can be generalized over large samples. So this particular technique, of course, is also used by dialectics, but was essentially initially used by the positivists. So as I said, use of quantitative techniques in the form of survey instruments, or observation or experiments, conduct over large samples with a focus to generalize the findings, and the objective is to predict consumer behavior and generalize these findings to broad marketing situations. So this was the quantitative research in consumer behavior. If you come to qualitative research, it comprises research techniques which are used to gather qualitative data. So we basically collect qualitative data. Non-statistical tools are used, like in-depth interviews, focus group interviews, projective techniques, also observation. Observation is also used as a technique to collect qualitative data. So we make use of focus group interviews, or observation or projective techniques to basically collect qualitative data. This data is collected over smaller samples. Object is to understand the consumer better. The subject is the approach is highly subjective in nature, non-empirical in nature, and the basic focus is what, where, how, when, how often. So these are questions: what does a consumer buy, when, how, where, often, how often. So these are the various issues which should be actually addressed by qualitatively through qualitative research. Okay, so the focus again was on understanding consumer behavior and consumption patterns. Objective is to gain understanding of consumer behavior. Of course, the findings cannot be generalized, and as we have discussed earlier, this particular approach was used by interpretivists, and it is again today being used by dialectics. So this is something these are the two research paradigms in consumer behavior. Now consumer behavior basically makes use of both the approaches. So both the approaches are used in combination. They are used in conjunction with each other. Qualitative research is very often a prelude to quantitative research. Okay, so findings from qualitative research are used to prepare scales for surveys and for instruments. So, we start with qualitative research, we try to gain insights into consumers, into consumer segments, into market segments through focus group interviews, through observation, through projective techniques. Thereafter, once we have assessed the market qualitatively, we formulate or we devise scales which are further used for surveys and for experiments. In some cases, of course, quantitative data may also act as a precursor to qualitative research, and the findings from quantitative are corroborative by qualitative research. So, they both help each other, they are often used in conjunction. While we say that it is the qualitative and then we move from qualitative to quantitative, but the other way around also works, and very often the findings from quantitative data are corroborated through the use of qualitative research. So, this brings us to the conclusion of the session 1 of module 2. But before we do come up with the conclusion, let us mention some references for further reading. You have Loudon and Della Bitta, which is a book on consumer behavior from Tata McGraw-Hill. There is Peter and Olson, again consumer behavior and marketing strategy from McGraw-Hill. We have Schiffman and Kanuk as consumer behavior from Prentice Hall. We have Wells and Prensky from John Wiley. There is a very nice article which you would like to read probably, which is by Marsden and Littler, and it speaks of a dialectical approach to consumer research beyond positivism and postmodernism. This was published, actually it was edited in a book called European Advances in Consumer Research volume 4, and so this particular this particular article is a nice one. Now, let us come to some frequently asked questions. So, what are the various questions which can be asked from this particular session? The first question that can be asked is, establish a relationship between market research and consumer behavior. Well, we have already discussed this in detail about how both market research and consumer research and consumer behavior, they start with the marketing concept. So, if we look at the marketing concept, which is the edifice of the consumer behavior, and which is contributed, market research contributes greatly to consumer behavior. It is through market research that we will be able to understand consumers better. Market research will give us insights into the customer needs and wants, the environment facing a company, and forces in the environment, micro forces. It will tell us about the viability of segments, and so it will basically help us devise proper strategies. So, market research contributes immensely to the study of consumer behavior. The second question that can be asked is, discuss and differentiate between traditional approaches to studying consumer behavior. So, we have the two traditional approaches, the positivist approach and the interpretivist approach. The positive approach basically spoke about predicting consumer behavior, focus on large samples, object was to generalize these findings, use of quantitative tools and techniques. Okay. As on the other side, we have interpretivists, who basically did not focus on predicting consumer behavior, but understanding the act of purchase and consumption. Okay. They used qualitative tools, the focus was on small samples, and they said that any kind of generalization was not possible. So, this is the difference between the two of them. Then we speak about, the third question is, write a short note on the current approaches to studying consumer behavior. When we spoke about the current approaches to studying consumer behavior, we are essentially speaking about the dialectics, okay, or the current approach. As we just said, dialectics or the current approach has 4 sub approaches in the form of materialism, change, totality, and contradiction. So, materialism says consumers are highly materialistic in nature. Change says that consumer behavior is something which is very dynamic, because the consumer operates in an environment which is essentially dynamic and very, very complex. Totality says it's essential to study the consumer holistically, study him against a backdrop of individual and determinants or psychographic determinants, as well as external environment or the sociographic components and the situational influences. And then of course, the contradiction says that it says that a lot of consumer behavior actually arises from internal contradictions in the form of moods and affect and feeling. Your cognitively, your mind may say that yes, buy a product X because of better functionality, but you end up buying product Y or brand Y because you feel you like it much better, it's aesthetically more appealing. So the internal contradictions and moods and emotions have a big role to play. So these are the three approaches. So these are the 4 sub approaches to studying the current approach of study of consumer behavior. Now let us come to some self evaluation tests. For example, we will start with some true and false statements, and the first statement is that the positivist approach to studying consumer behavior treats consumer decision making process as one of subjective. So the answer to this is no. It is the interpretivist approach which says consumer decision making is something which is subjective. Okay. So the answer to the first question is false. The positivist approach to studying consumer behavior treats consumer decision making process as one which is subjective. This is false. The second question: according to the interpretivist approach, consumer actions cannot be objectively measured, empirically tested and generalized. Okay. So according to the interpretivist approach, consumer actions cannot be objectively measured, empirically tested and generalized. The answer to this is true. Okay. So you cannot basically generalize or empirically test consumer action and consumer behavior. The third statement is positivist approach to studying consumer behavior relies on qualitative research methods. So this again is a false statement. The positivist approach to studying consumer behavior relies on a quantitative research methods. Some of the multiple choice questions. Okay. So which of the following is not one of the current approaches to studying consumer behavior? Okay. Postmodernism, change, materialism and totality. Okay. So the answer to this is A. Postmodernism is not one of the approaches of studying, not one of the current approaches of studying consumer behavior. The 4 current approaches are change, materialism, totality and contradiction. Okay. Second question: which of the following is true about postmodernism? A. Consumer actions cannot be objectively measured, empirically tested and generalized. Focus lies in predicting consumer behavior. Methodology is quantitative. D. None of the above. So A. Consumer actions cannot be objectively measured, empirically tested and generalized. B. Focus lies in predicting consumer behavior. C. Methodology is quantitative. And D. None of the above. So answer to this is well, you guessed it right. It is A. Okay. So consumer actions cannot be objectively measured, empirically tested and generalized. This is a true statement about postmodernism. Fill in the blanks. Dash is the systematic collection, analysis and interpretation of data related to the market and to the surrounding environment. So what is the systematic collection, analysis and interpretation of data related to the market and to the environment? It says market research. Market research is the systematic collection, analysis and interpretation of data related to the market and to the environmental forces. Dash treat the study of consumer behavior as an applied science. Okay. So who treats study of consumer behavior as an applied science? The positivists. It is the positivists who treat the study of consumer behavior as an applied science. So the answer to this particular fill in the blanks is positivists. Forces in question number 3. Forces in the environment that affect the company indirectly comprise the dash environment. Forces in the environment that affect the company directly comprise the dash environment. The answer to this is macro environment. Answer to this is macro environment. Okay. The focus of the dash approach is to predict consumer behavior. The focus of the dash approach is to predict consumer behavior. The focus of the positivist approach is to predict consumer behavior. So, you have forces in the environment that affect company indirectly comprise the macro environment, and the focus of the positivist approach is to predict consumer behavior. So, the last question, what do you understand by the microenvironment? The microenvironment is all the forces in the environment that are close to the company and impact the company directly. Okay. So, it is the company's internal environment, its customers, its competitors, its suppliers, its vendors, its dealers, its distributors, all of this comprise what we call as the microenvironment. They are forces which impact the organization directly. 2. Give any components that make up the macro environment. Okay, so, the macro environment, as we have just said, is the environment surrounding a company which affects the company indirectly via the micro environment. So, what are the various forces in the macro environment? There could be many, demographic, legal, technological, political, cultural, national, okay, natural, environmental, all of these are forces which surround the company and surround the organization and have an impact on the organization indirectly via the micro environment. Okay. Question number 3, name the 2 traditional approaches to studying consumer behavior. So, the 2 traditional approaches to studying consumer behavior are the positivist and the interpretivist. Okay. So, these are the 2 approaches of studying consumer behavior in the traditional form. This brings us to the end of session 1 of module 2. So, in the next session we shall be speaking about the consumer research process. So, I hope you have benefited from this session, and we will be moving with this module again in the next session. Thank you.